Welcome back to History and Politics Chat on Tuesday evenings at 4 o'clock. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. I'm going to get right to it today because there's a lot of questions people had. And I don't, the truth is, I don't think I've got anything hugely earth-shattering to talk about today. There is earth-shattering news as of a few minutes ago, to me anyway. That's why I'm a few minutes late. The Trump administration has ordered pullouts of troops from all over the world, which is, I need to unpack that. It's something I'm going to be doing tonight. It's a multifaceted a multifaceted and multilateral decision that is going to be very interesting, I think, to see how it plays out. So if today is like you have other stuff to do, I don't think you're going to miss anything earth-shattering if you decide to, I don't know, do something important like go bake chocolate chip cookies. But if you do want to hang around, I'm going to try and hit a bunch of different material. And I want to start today with something that is continuing to bother people a lot. And one of the things that's been very interesting about the questions that I've gotten this week, not just today, but this week, is the degree of the amount of anxiety in the country and the amount of it really feels like people don't have their feet under them and they're very nervous and worried. And I cannot tell you what's going to happen because nobody can. I have some pretty good ideas about what's going to happen. I have a pretty good sense that the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow and set in the west. And I have ideas as a historian about what looks like things are going to happen. I cannot reassure you that everything's going to be perfect. I just can't. Nobody can. But I can maybe give you some historical perspective that can help you put your feet back under you a little bit. And there's a reason that I think this is really important to do. So let me start right here by saying, no, I do not believe that Donald Trump is going to launch a coup, either militarily or otherwise. I think, personally, that the turning point that took that off the table was last summer when the military, and a coup is literally when the military comes and takes over from a duly elected official or from the process to put a strong man in power, was when the military last summer made it very clear, and I've talked about this, I think, every week for the last 3 weeks, the military made it very clear they would not support the president if he made an unconstitutional grab for power. And they didn't come out and say, we hate him. They came out and said, we stand on the Constitution. That's what we swore an oath of loyalty to. And that's really significant. And again, I talk about this a lot because the American military has a very long tradition of its own, a very long history, and a very storied history, and certainly a negative history at times as well. But the military leaders are answering not only to Donald Trump, but to their own history. And they're not going to do something that flies in the face of that. Now, there's an exception to that, and that is the law enforcement officers who come under the purview now of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, not all of them. Some, like the Coast Guard, were moved into that, and the Coast Guard has a totally great history. Of course, people here in Maine think they're the cat's meow, but some of the law enforcement divisions that are in the Department of Homeland Security were reorganized and rebuilt after 9/11, and then they were later incorporated into Department of Homeland Security. And many of those are overseen by political officials, political appointees who do not have that institutional memory. And that means that they are Donald Trump appointees, and they are answering to people with a political agenda, and they don't have that long history. And that concerns me very much. That's something that I would love to see us put some boundaries around, simply because I don't think you ever want to have a military organization that is responsible to a political appointee, certainly not in a democracy. So that's something that concerns me. But the military itself is not going to sign on to a coup, or at least if it is, it's hidden that extremely well by coming out one person after another and saying, no, we don't want any part of this. So that was a really big deal when that happened last summer. But there's also a number of other things, other signs that you should be looking for. And that is that, Donald Trump lost this election by a lot. So this is not one of those things where you can say, oh, he won the popular vote but he didn't get it in the Electoral College. By the way, that's never happened to a Democrat. It's happened 4 times with a Republican, never with a Democrat, where people could really come and say, oh, there's a real problem here. And certainly with the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, Nixon's supporters wanted to make that same argument that Kennedy had been illegally elected. And again, to his credit, Nixon didn't want any part of that, but that got shot down pretty quickly. But there's a while in the Nixon papers where you can see people saying, this is it. We're going to be able to take this election away from Kennedy, and that doesn't happen. So there's the fact that this is not a close election, and the fact that the Trump administration does not really even appear to be significantly contesting this election. That is, there are lawsuits that you've heard about in a lot of places, but they're really not even bothering to fill out the paperwork in a lot of those cases. At this point, the major attorneys who were involved with the cases have resigned from them, have withdrawn from them. Right now, Rudy Giuliani is arguing the one in Pennsylvania. And again, if you want to know more about this, follow Mark E. Elias on Twitter. Right now, the Trump administration's lawsuits over the election, they've lost 25 times. They've won one minor lawsuit, and they've lost 25. 1 in 25 is not a good outcome if you're trying to make to change the way things happen. Similarly, you guys are all writing to me about, could Trump overturn the electors in the states like Pennsylvania and have them return an entirely new set of Republican electors? Possibly, if all the chips fell in the right way, yes, possibly. But before you go, oh my God, she said yes. The state legislatures in all of the contested states have said they're not going to do that. So, and think about their interests as well. Well, maybe there are some Republicans in those states who would like that. They still, again, have to deal with the fact that the whole point is here that a majority of the state voted for the Democrat. So, so that doesn't look like it's going to happen either. So before you really get more and more upset about this, no, it does not look like that's what's going on. Now, there's other stuff that is going on that is really concerning. And again, I've gotten a gazillion emails about this story that is circulating on One American News and on Newsmax, maybe. And it might even have been mentioned on the Fox News channel, although I doubt it because it's so far out there, I don't even think Fox would touch it. And that is a story that's been circulating by Louis Gohmert of Texas. And was picked up and run with by, wasn't Gohmert said it, and then somebody else echoed it. One of the usual suspects, I don't remember which one, on Twitter. And that is that there was a German server that, I don't even remember the whole story. I pulled it up here. Said that that the U.S. Army, possibly the CIA, led a raid on a server, on a company that had a server in Frankfurt, Germany, that recovered extremely compelling data that detailed that there were major switches of votes from Trump to Biden. Okay, so first of all, this is completely made up out of whole cloth. There is a company by that name. It does not have any facilities in Germany. And there is no evidence anywhere of this. There was no raid on the company. The company is majorly is a logistics system. And the only evidence of this is this rando tweet from Louis Gohmert, who's not exactly known for his how to put this. One does not go for intelligence briefings to Louis Gohmert. This is completely made up. And I watched the videos where there's now One American News is saying, a congressman, and they make it sound like it's official. It's just propaganda. It's not, there's nothing there. So that raises sort of another question, and that is what's going on with this attempt to create and to destabilize our faith in our electoral systems. Because one of the things that's really interesting to me is that our intelligence and cybersecurity units in the government claim that this was the most secure election that they know of. And that's a really interesting thing in a lot of different ways, not least because you may or may not remember that in the Senate, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's a Republican of Kentucky, refused to put forward any additional money into cybersecurity. He has consistently played down the idea of needing any cybersecurity. And now I've given you fact until now. Now I'm going to editorialize for a minute. I am finding this whole thing fascinating because, and I'm completely editorializing here, which I probably shouldn't do with this many people watching me, but I'm like glued to my chair, fascinated by this, because I actually think, and I do not have evidence for this, I'm just thinking at what's there. I'm looking at the Trump administration's extraordinary refusal to let the Biden camp see anything of theirs. They were okay before the election. Now they won't. I don't think he had any intention of losing this election. I don't, when he won't let Biden see the COVID plans, I don't think there are any. Or if they are, they're not terribly well done. And I really think that he expected, between the United States Postal Service slowdowns and the suppression of votes in Florida and all the things that went on, I think he really expected that he was going to go ahead and be able to pull this election off. And now he's scrambling because there's nothing. I mean, he's got to hand this over, and I think he's mortified at the idea that all this is going to come out. Again, that was editorializing, and now I'm going to go back to non-editorializing. So what are they doing when they are trying to destabilize faith in our electoral system, which actually looks like it was the strongest in terms of cybersecurity that's ever been? And the answer to that is twofold. I think, first of all, there is an attempt on the part of Donald Trump himself to set up power going forward. And that is not necessarily, and I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds here, that is not necessarily because he expects to stay at the head of the Republican Party. There's a lot of articles about that out there. Remember, Donald Trump is an old man who didn't particularly like politics. He likes the media, and he's very good at the media. So it might be that he wants to stay in charge of the Republican Party, but it might be that he simply wants to keep his base behind him for whatever he decides to do next. And one of the ways to do that is the psychological trick, if you will, of constantly requiring attention, which is why the rest of us are so exhausted. But if he constantly requires attention, if he just said, okay, sure, I lost the election, good luck to you, he suddenly becomes a lame duck and nobody pays attention to him. This is keeping him in the news. So partly it might be simply a way to maintain attention, not necessarily to stay in charge of the Republican Party, though, although maybe. But it also is again, if you step back and look at where we are, it is really interesting the degree to which America has been destabilized in the last 4 years. And I don't mean the divisions that I'm going to talk about. I mean faith in our system has been uprooted in the last 4 years to a degree that many people did not think was possible. Historians did think it was possible because we watched this sort of thing. But I don't know how many people said to me, 4 years, how much damage can he do? He could do a lot of damage. And this is one of the reasons that, as I say, I am so interested in the withdrawal of troops from all over the country, all over the world, because if you stop looking at, as I have been doing, as an independent thing, why troops out of Afghanistan, why troops out of Syria, why, who's benefiting here? It's a little hard to make a pattern out of it, but if you take one more step back and say, well, if America proves to be an unreliable partner all over the world, there goes NATO. And NATO, of course, has been one of the major stabilizing factors on the world since its inception in the 1950s. And certainly the person who hates NATO more than anything is Vladimir Putin of Russia, but also any of the autocrats that Donald Trump gets along with. So it's really kind of a major, destabilizing our system is one more way to sort of destabilize the idea of democracy. And that idea of democracy, I think, is very much on the table right now in the world. And I don't mean that in like America is heavier than everybody else, and our democracy matters more than everybody else. No, I mean the system of democracy is up against the wall in a lot of places in the world because of the rise of autocrats, especially oligarchs. And that, we're players in that. We're not leaders in that anymore. We're players in that. And that might be part of what's going on in what just seems a bizarro attempt to destabilize what was an election. It was a legitimate election. And again, I think that feeds into a lot of the other stuff going on. I do think what is most bizarre about it to me is not only, of course, that we're not recognizing, which was really quite a large sweep for Biden, with some exceptions, and I'll mention that in a second, but that it appears that the emperor had no clothes. I mean, Donald Trump's not doing anything right now. He doesn't have anything on his schedule. He's golfing. He's not. I mean, the idea that the president can just check out, it's a really interesting thing, because he may or may not remember back during the impeachment when people were saying, he needs to break a law in order to be impeached. And I kept saying, no, you can impeach a president just for, sitting in his office playing video games all day. It never occurred to me that somebody would actually do that. And now here we are. So that's actually been the other interesting thing. I think we're going to discover that a lot of this is that the emperor had no clothes. And that's one of the things that Trump is worried about revealing. Now, I just said this was quite a large sweep, and I could just hear through the internet people going, wait a minute, the Democrats lost seats in the House, and it was not what people expected. Again, speaking as a historian here, as a historian who studies American politics, as a historian who studies American political voting, what is astonishing about this moment is the degree of voter suppression. And this is, somebody asked me what was the election in which there was the most voter suppression in the country. And of course, we can't know that, because the whole point of suppressing the vote is you can't know who doesn't show up. But we are at a level that looks to me quite like the 1890s and the 1900s, the period when, of course, African Americans were not voting, especially across the South, but also immigrants in the North. And what happens is after 1890, after the Mississippi Constitution of 1890, we get the idea that you shouldn't be able to vote if you can't read the Constitution and interpret the Constitution or own property. Each state has different things, but every state, except one, rewrites its constitution after the 1890 Mississippi Constitution to limit the vote. And it limits both the black vote and the white immigrant vote across the country. One of my favorite statistics, and I'm going to get this absolutely wrong because I don't have it in front of me and I haven't read the book in a while, talks about how after the Mississippi Constitution goes into effect and other states follow suit, that Louisiana goes from something like having 105% of its eligible voters voting to down to something like 50. And yes, that first number, even though I don't think it was necessarily 105, before the Constitution went into effect, people were double counted. And those, of course, would be white people. It was a southern state. The book that comes from a book about the South. So anyway, the fact that the Democrats did as well as they could under what seems to have been an attempt to keep Democrats from voting, and as well to suppress the vote. And by that, I mean the long lines and the lack of machines and the lack of drop boxes and the USPS slowing things down. And not our Postal Service workers, who are terrific, but the chain of command there. That this is what has people like Lindsey Graham of South Carolina tied up in knots, because he knows full well that once Democrats get to change the rules back to what they used to be, the Republicans are in really, really, really hard shape. And again, this is not new to this minute. This is an old pattern in American history. And it's one of the things that I hit again and again and again, because in a democracy, what happens, you need to have at least two political parties, and I hope to get into a point where I can talk more about that. But the reason you don't want to manipulate the vote in this fashion is because to make sure one party wins is because what happens is the people who run that party get more and more and more extreme, and they get weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. And so you get to a point where eventually they have turned off so many people that they can't even hold their own supporters. They let those people in, and they change the rules to go back to let everybody else in, and the pendulum swings way the heck the other way again. And you could my comparison is always to like a soccer game. Like if you need the refs to hold things even, because that makes both players play at the top of their ability. Both sets of players play at the top of their ability. But if the refs start calling it so that one team is allowed to cheat and allowed to, I don't know the rules, soccer, whatever's illegal, I don't know, spike the other guy's leg or whatever, I don't know what that is. If they let them do that, these players, the ones that are getting hammered on, they're going to get better and better, because in order to stay somewhat even. But eventually it's going to be too great for them even to hold their own, and they're going to lose and they're going to lose. But this side, while they're getting strong, this side is getting weaker and weaker because they don't need to be able to play. They know they can work the refs. And eventually what's going to happen is either that small team, that the refs is protecting, the weak team that the refs are protecting, is simply going to kill the other side, or people are going to say, we don't want to watch this game any longer because it's not fair any longer. And they're going to go ahead and they're going to rework the rules so they're fair again. And once they're fair again, those players who've been playing walking uphill all that time, they're just going to cream the other side, because the other side's fat and lazy. It doesn't know how to play any longer. So this is one of the reasons that you don't want, even if it's your team that's getting all the advantages, you don't want your team to have all the advantages. You want them to have to scrap, because otherwise they're going to get weaker and weaker and weaker, and they're not going to be able to play the game any longer. And that's exactly what happens in a democracy with slightly different terms. All right. So, there is, as I say, then no overt military coup, but what we need to be very careful of is that there is no doubt in my mind, none, that we are looking at the rise of authoritarianism in this country through democratic means, and that's no less dangerous for the fact that it is not as visible. And I hope to get to more of that in a second as well, and how that's happened. So one of the questions that people have asked is about Lindsey Graham, because last night the news broke that Brad Ravensberger, I think is how you pronounce it, who is the Secretary of State in Georgia, said that, I feel like I'm writing a novel here. He said, actually, I wrote this sentence about 4 times last night because there were so many people. He said, she said. The guy who's the Secretary of State in Georgia is a Republican. His name is Brad Ravensberger, I think is how you pronounce it. And he is no even-handed dude, let me tell you. He worked hand in hand with Georgia Governor Kemp to go ahead and suppress the votes in 2018 so that Stacey Abrams did not become governor. So Ravensberger is very much a dyed-in-the-wool sort of movement conservative Republican. He's no turncoat there at all. He said, I've been part of this whole project all along. But yesterday, he is under enormous pressure, was under enormous pressure to recount the votes in Georgia, which happened. I think the final recount was just before I came on here, and he said everything was fine, no changes, or thereabouts. Don't quote me on that because I haven't read all the articles because I was coming on here. But it basically said that Georgia's fine. But what matters about this is that, according to him, Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican of South Carolina and the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, and that's the Judiciary Committee is the one that handles legal stuff. So theoretically, they're the real legal eagles in the Senate, which is supposed to be a really big deal. That Lindsey Graham called him, and according to Ravensberger, basically said, how can we throw out Democratic ballots? And I'm cutting to the chase there. He didn't literally say that. According to Ravensberger, he said in some counties there are signature mismatches on the mail-in ballots, which is common. I mean, think about it. So your signature changes through time, maybe sometimes quite significantly. Mine has changed. I had an accident a number of years ago and lost the use of my right hand. So I can barely hold a pen any longer. And you couldn't possibly, if you looked at any document I had signed before the accident, you wouldn't know it was the same signature. And but I'm still the same person, just had an unfortunate event. But so that happens. So apparently Lindsey Graham said, why don't we take the counties where that happened a lot and just throw out all the ballots from those counties? We'll just say they were all bad. And Ravensberger's like, that's illegal. Even for a dyed-in-the-wool Republican operative, I'm not doing that. And he went and said so. And then Lindsey Graham said, oh, that's ridiculous. Of course, I didn't say that. And somebody said, well, why were you calling the Secretary of State of Georgia anyway? Like, you're from South Carolina and you got nothing to do with this. And so then Graham came out and said, well, I called the Secretaries of State of Nevada and Arizona as well. And instantly the Secretary of State from, I think it was Arizona, but it might have been Nevada, went on Twitter and said, no, you never called me. So now we have this situation where Graham appears to have tried to intervene in Georgia over the vote in Georgia. And it was on the same day that Donald Trump was tweeting about it. So the question is, did what Graham did violate any laws? So first of all, one thing, we don't know that this really happened. The fact that, oh, I'm sorry, there's one more thing. There was somebody on the telephone call between Graham and Ravensberger who corroborated Ravensberger's version of it, said, yes, in fact, Lindsey Graham did say that. So there were witnesses, which is why you kind of like to have witnesses on phone calls, by the way, for something like that. So anyway, so if he did it, yes, this is illegal. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not the judge and I'm not the jury, but yes, this, if you look at the laws of Georgia, you can't throw out ballots, So yes, that's a problem. Now, somebody else said, will he be charged with that? That's a different question, isn't it? Because what a messy time we're in. I just don't know the answer to that. Should there be an investigation? 1,000,000% yes. This is not okay. But I want to go a step further and talk about what this means. What does it mean that the chair of the Judiciary Committee was willing to throw out votes in order to skew the results in a state? That's a way bigger problem than Lindsey Graham. That really is what I was talking about. The attempt to undermine our democratic system by soft power rather than through a military coup. And what's more scary about this is, if tanks were rolling through the streets, people would go, oh, wow, we have a problem. But how many people are paying attention to Lindsey Graham's phone calls to the Georgia Secretary of State? I mean, you guys are, but how many of your neighbors do you think are paying attention to that? And that is why this frightens me so much, is because I do think, as I say, that American democracy, and democracy in general, but I'm an Americanist, American democracy is under attack by people who do not believe in the idea of our democracy, of human self-determination. They certainly do not believe that all of us have an equal right to have a say in our government, because they're willing to stop certain of us from voting. And what that comes down to is that either you believe that society works best when we crowdsource it, when everybody has a say, and that includes, I have somebody in mind here, people that I don't necessarily think, I certainly don't want them to have any control over my life, but either I believe you throw all those people into a pot and you believe that the majority of us will choose the right answer, or you have no faith in the people and you say, really, we can't trust people like Richardson and the, PJ Vickery, and we can't trust those people because they want stuff that we think is bad for society, and we must, and you can define that we in different ways. In this case, I think we means Republican white men, for the most part, are the only ones who really understand how society works. And we need to concentrate power amongst ourselves, because what we're going to do is we're going to turn the government over to businessmen who do know how to not exploit things. That's the wrong word. They wouldn't use exploit. Know how to use resources most efficiently to promote wealth and the economy. And that's what's going to move society forward. And the problem is those two things are incompatible. Either you trust democracy, or you think we need to have a hierarchy with certain people on top. And right now, I think what I see anyway is people like Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, of course, all thinking that what I want and what the majority of Americans want is not what they want, and it's not good for the country. And so they're keeping us from voting. They are keeping our ideas from being heard, and they are trying to go ahead and rig the system so that no matter how hard we try, we can't regain control of our country. And that is not democracy. And I'm going to tell you, that never goes in a good direction. That never goes in a good direction. If you don't believe me, look at the South after the Civil War, when even if you're a white supremacist, you look at what happened in the South after the Civil War, where the idea of voting, widespread voting, is destroyed, not only for African Americans, but also for poor whites. And what you end up with is a society that stagnated economically until World War II. For 70 or more years, the South was this backwater. I mean, now it's come to life, but it didn't come to life until it got federal investment in it. Because if you have that kind of a system, nobody can invest in a one-party state, because it doesn't matter what the laws are, it matters who you know. So there's no way that somebody is going to go into that sort of a system with money to invest and to rebuild. So to do that, to remove the idea that everybody is equal before the law, is also to remove all of the safeguards that make it reasonable to go ahead and start a business or to invest or to move in, because you never, you get on the wrong side of the powerful clique and you're dead. So this is a huge problem, I think, and it's something that I have spent my life fighting and intend to continue to spend my life fighting, because I believe in our system. I believe in the idea of human self-determination. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about McConnell, but this brings up that something somebody else said, and that is they are looking at the appointments that Joe Biden is making in his administration, and they are dismayed at how conservative they seem to be. They are not, to their minds, progressive, the kind of progressive appointments that person would like to see. So let me talk a little bit about how the process works. I've talked about how the process works in terms of, sort of generally, and in terms of the primaries, that usually what moves society forward is if you have pressure coming from two different kinds of groups. You have the establishment figures, and I'm going to pick here on the women's movement in the late 19th century, because while most people have heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and maybe Lucy, what's her name, from England. I don't do that well in other countries. Anyway, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they tend to be militant. They tend to be in your face. They tend to be a little frightening to a lot of people. And they tend to be, outspoken and all sorts of places. They get attention. But they work together, even if they don't seem to like each other, they work together with a different group of activists, and those are the institutionalists. Because what the institutionalists do is they look much less threatening. And this would be Julia Ward Howe, for example, and Lucy Stone and the American Women's Suffrage Association. And they're like, we're not like those people. All we want to do is have a fair shake. And what happens is, if you've got my little balls here, you got the extremists, and I'm using that term. I'm using that term advisedly to talk about political change. I'm not making a judgment about those people. I'm trying to set up categories here. People who don't want change look at these people, and it'd be very easy to dismiss them. But they look at these people whom they do not find threatening, and they say, I don't mind having Julia Ward Howe over for dinner. She sounds like a nice lady, but I'm not going to have anything to do with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And what happens is the Julia Ward Howes can then say to them, you better give us what we want, or you're going to get stuck with those people. And that 1-2 punch is really effective. It's really effective. You've got to remember, people like Nixon, who is quite a conservative figure in many ways. He does things like signs into law major changes. Like I don't want to say one off the top of my head because I'll probably get the date wrong. Major changes because he's afraid of what he sees as the radicals on the fringe. So he actually ends up making a lot of changes for the more moderate people in society. So why do I mention all this? Joe Biden has always had the reputation of being dead in the center of the Democratic Party. That's just who he is, dead in the center. So, and he's an institutionalist. And right now, to my mind, we desperately need an institutionalist to rebuild all the institutions that Donald Trump has destroyed. He's going to put people in the offices, and they're going to be people who know the laws. And that's one of the things that he's done. He's grabbed people like Ron Klain, who's an institute. I mean, he's been around forever, and he really knows how things work. He gets stuff through. He's the one who got Klain is the one who got Ruth Bader Ginsburg's appointment through. And you just got to know that stuff. You got to know what buttons to push. And people are either good at that or they're not. I'm not. I'm much more of the I see it and I want to do something about it thing. But I have friends who can say I want to get to here. But in order to get to here, I've got to do this here and this here and this here. And they work the room until they end up accomplishing things that one would think would be impossible. I would think would be impossible. And they would be impossible if you had me doing it. But that's the sort of person who's an institutionalist. And you need those people. So when you look at Biden, look at the team. And if you don't like where that team is, and mind you, none of us is going to like all the appointments. That's the whole point of having a team. You want to like 51% of the appointments because other people have to like appointments too. And one of the things about the Democratic Party that I want to write about one of these days is that unlike the Republicans who never had this impulse, the Democrats have baked into their DNA since the time of Andrew Jackson the idea that government should literally look like America. Literally, you should put the same people in office that you are representing. So Biden is literally going to put some Bernie Sanders people in there, and he is literally going to put some Pete Buttigieg people in there. He is literally going to pull from all over, and you're not going to like them all. But what you want to do is to recognize that's how an institutionalist works. And if you don't like where this country is going, the great beauty of having an institutionalist in charge, especially one who plays to the middle of his party, is you can pressure them. And that's going to be the whole story of the Biden administration. The last thing anybody should be doing right now is sitting down and saying, it's done, Biden's elected. Right now is the time to say, okay, now we have the system back, or we're about to get the system back. Now let's change the system. But the problem is you needed to have that system rebuilt, or we would have huge, huge trouble. I think anyway, I'm a big believer in the institutional system. It frustrates me as much as it frustrates everybody else. But here's why I like it. I really believe that for a democracy to survive, you need to have a level of bureaucracy that is not loyal to an individual, that's loyal to the state, to the concept of this. Their paycheck's going to come, whether it's Biden or Trump or me, they don't care. They're doing their job. And I really believe that and this is a theory that comes from the colonial era, actually, the idea that American democracy developed because of the weird reason that we're so far from England, that we ended up having bureaucrats who switched in and out sort of at random times. We developed this idea that you could be loyal to the state without being loyal to one party and one person or another. And that rebuilding of that impartial state is really important, to my mind, for stability. Because you need stability, or else then you got real problems. But then you can change what that state does by putting pressure on the institutionalists. I hope I made that clear. That was kind of poli-sci, not even 101. And I know it's a little bit complicated, but for people who are already like, it's all over, it's not all over, it's just starting. And that's really important to remember, because one of the things that I want to do today and talk about today is that, and I hadn't intended to end here, but this fits so nicely, I'll do it here now, is that what I am reading when I read so many of your letters is people who feel like you have no control over the system. And you do. I mean, that's the beauty of this. And part of getting rid of the former president, who really acted like an abuser, is to recognize that just because somebody tells you you don't have power, you don't have to believe that. And what America now has the opportunity to do, what Americans have the opportunity to do, is to take back their power and to say, listen, I want this. Now you might not get it, but that's part of our system. You get to get together with people who think like you and demand those things, and to say, you know what? And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. I want the fairness doctrine back, and I don't want to hear no. Because if you can bloody well take off a video from Facebook that has, 3 bars of a copyrighted song instantly, you can certainly figure out how to take off false, off fake news. So we can make those demands, but you have to have confidence that you can make those demands. And once you do, this country's going to change. And if you don't believe me, let me give you an example. We look very similar in many ways to the 1890s. And this actually goes into somebody else's question that I'm going to pick up now. And that is, Ruth Bragg has asked this before, and I didn't get to it. Historically, plagues and wars have caused an outbreak of religiosity, spiritualism, and attempts to contact the dead, haven't they? Once again, I'm paraphrasing. She said it more intelligently than I just did. So what is going on? Is this what's happening in America right now? And the answer is yes. I think that's a very good observation, because what happens, and we're in a moment right now that looks very much like, as I say, the 1890s. And in the 1890s, like now, there were dramatic changes. And one of the things where there were dramatic changes in was in telecommunications. Now, telecommunications are a funny thing, because if you think, we're used to them now, right? But my parents have been dead, I don't know, 35, 40 years. If they saw me with this, what would they think? They didn't know computers, and this is my lifetime, right? So think about telecommunications. One of the things that happens in the 1870s in America is telephones. Telephones mean you can talk to people over unimaginable distances. What does that mean? What does it mean when in the past, if your kid went out to California, they were as good as dead? Now you can pick up a phone and talk to them. Like, distance suddenly is erased. Like, literally, distance goes away. Why shouldn't you be able to talk to the dead? Like, if you can talk to somebody in California, how is that distance that much different than being alive or being dead? It's not that there was some crazy, people had this weird thing where they believed in talking to the dead in the 19th century. I'm sorry, this is a big thing in the 19th century, is spiritualism and talking to the dead. It makes sense. It turns out they were wrong, but it's not that big a leap to say you can pick up a phone. Why can't you just pick up listen to the raps in the wall or whatever they did? Well, we're in a similar moment now where we've got this explosion of a new kind of technology. We don't know what the repercussions of it are. We don't know how it works. It's changing the way we do finances. It's changing the way we're talking to people. Look at me. I didn't know how to do this a year ago, and now I'm talking to all you people through a box on my desk. And one of the things that does is it destabilizes everything. People don't know. In the 19th century, they didn't know what was, I won't say what was alive and what was dead, but they certainly lost track of where the boundaries were between the two. Because where are the boundaries when all of a sudden distance is gone? Well, where are the boundaries and where are the changes now when most of our young people don't even know how a bank works, because they go to a box in the wall and take money out? And who is running our politics when all of a sudden that there's Facebook is doing all this stuff with advertising, and there's dark money. We don't know who's operating that, and what is Russia up to, and the Saudis, and there's a reason that everybody feels like the ground is not under their feet. And that is one of the things that I'm hearing from all of you people. It's like where is the ground? And the answer to that is really quite simple. The ground remains with us. The ground remains with our principles, and with what is, I think, basic human decency. Those rules will never change. They have not changed, and they will never change. and with common sense. I mean, I think I've said this before, one of the tricks to QAnon, and by the way, did you see the report that it turns out the QAnon people, the people that intelligence officers think is behind QAnon, have been hosting child pornography on their website? Surprise, surprise, right? But actually, that's another thing. The whole idea of children being attacked is also a sign of rapid changes in society. That is a trope in American history. It started at least by the time of the Salem witch trials, when one of the things that the Salem witches were supposed to be guilty of is abusing girls. Remember that? You probably don't, but it was. And that theme comes up again and again and again. In the 1830s and 1840s, the idea is that Catholic nuns are abusing girls in the convents, and I mean, it comes up again and again. And you probably remember the whole thing about once we got daycares, the idea that daycare centers were abusing children, and it's a trope when times are unsettled. People worry about their children, as well they should, but it's one of those psychological tropes, historical psychological tropes. So that's one of the things that people worry about. But think about it, like somebody wrote to me and said Joe Biden has a secret sex island, and I'm like, how did that happen? Tell me how that works. How does a man who's been in office for 48 years, in public office, including the second highest office in the land, one of the most powerful in the world, how does he maintain secrecy for all that time? I mean, literally, there's cameras everywhere. Like how do you pull off the planes, the house cleaners? You guys can do the same thing. This is not rocket science. This is this possible? Because so much of the unsettlingness of the world around us, and so much of the unsettlingness that Trump has been feeding with this election, with his administration, with all the things that are with the Fox News channel, with One American News, with all that stuff, is making you get to the point where you doubt everything you ever knew. What is the truth any longer? You just don't know. And this goes back to one of my real concerns about this moment. That is what people who study authoritarian regimes say is the central piece that needs to be in place for the rise of authoritarianism, is that people no longer know what to trust. They no longer know what to believe, and they don't trust anything. And what I'm going to say to you is that you do know what to trust. You know to trust your values, whatever they are, and you know to trust your friends and the people around you. I mean, that's the other thing that's so astonishing as we're going to these media bubbles, is that, people think horrible things about each other. And, I know a lot of people, and I know a few real rotters for sure, but, most people are pretty decent, and they're just trying to get through the day. So this demonization and the lack of knowing what's real, you do know what's real, and you do know what you value, and you do have the power to make those values public. And, from my perspective, the values I care about are the values of a democratic society. I care about facts. I care about learning. I care about constructing our policies based in facts. And I care about morality. And that's not a religious thing. I care that we do the right thing, even when it's hard. And those are things that are hardly unique to me. And you know that. You know that your feet can stay under you, and that you're not the one who's crazy. The people who are crazy are the ones who are trying to destabilize you. And how do you know that? How do you know it's not you, it's them? Because you can do a fact check. Like when Louis Gohmert writes a tweet that's completely made up, he has no facts to back it up. This is one of the reasons I always put my sources down on these things I write. And I will freely admit I am not right 100% of the time. That's the whole point. I want people to come in and say, hey, you screwed this up. Hey, you got this wrong. Because that's how we learn. If somebody can't tell you what their sources are, and somebody circulated something the other day, I had this on good authority from somebody in the intelligence community. What does that mean? Show me the documents. Show me who it is. You can trust a newspaper when they say we have these sources because their standing depends on it. Journalists develop secret sources like that you have faith in. But somebody saying, I know a secret and I'll tell you a secret and I promise you it's real, unless you have some reason to think that somebody has that, why would you trust that? You wouldn't trust that coming from your friends if they just said, hey, I know secretly that the grocery store is about to make, pecans 35 cents a pound, I'd sure want to see it in reality before I decided to invest in a year's supply of pecans. If anybody doesn't cook with pecans, they're very expensive if you're a baker. So anyway, so you do know the answer to those things, and so the question then is a couple of things. I want to put a couple more questions together here, and that is that where are we going? And I want to build off Ruth's question, and that is, this time of destabilization, people are turning to religious figures, they're turning to rumors. And by the way, the 1890s, which is a place that I love, and nobody studied this, somebody needs to write a book on it. I don't think anybody has, and it won't be me, because I've written my books on the 1890s, at least those books. And that is that there are a number of messiahs who rise in the 1890s, in the African American community, in the indigenous community, in the white community. There are a whole bunch of, in the black community, did I say that? In the black community, there's a couple in the black community. There are people that others want to follow, because it's so much easier to have somebody tell you how to think than it is to think for yourself. It's so much easier to have somebody give you hope if you can't hope for yourself. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now too. So where are we going? So there's two things I wanted to point to here. One of those is that I am very concerned about that lack of basis in fact in our public discourse. And I do the best I can, and certainly a lot of people do the best they can, but we are walking uphill when we've got Newsmax out there and One American News and Facebook circulating crap and all the stuff that's out there. And I really feel strongly that we are in the mess we're in because of the end of the fairness doctrine during the Reagan administration, when the Federal Communications Commission, full of Reagan appointees, destroyed the fairness doctrine. And the fairness doctrine came out of a period, the 1890s, which is one in which the political partisanship had gotten so bad that people were in their own media bubbles. And Americans recognized that this was so destructive that we were not going to be able to move forward as a country unless we tried to create an independent news that was not beholden to one side or the other. And from that, we get the rise of what were called independent newspapers. And these are all the biggies, although some of them still continued to go ahead and be partisan, like the Chicago Tribune was, and the whole Chicago Tribune network. If anybody's here remembering Chicago in the mid-20th century, you'll remember this. But for the most part, there was this dedication to real independent news that required that you were based in fact and that you gave a fair look at the other side. Now, again, everybody had opinions, but they were within a much smaller spectrum, and they had to be based in fact. Louis Gohmert could not, I mean, he's a congressman, he can do whatever he wants, but One American News could not have repeated what Louis Gohmert said and say this is news. What they could have said is Louis Gohmert said this, that's true. But what they couldn't have done is said there is this server that did whatever it did in Germany, because that's not true. I would like very much to see that happen, and I intend to put a lot of weight behind that to try and force there to be some kind of a reckoning that you cannot poison our political discourse with lies, because that's what they are lies. And we cannot have a democracy unless our population is operating with the same set of facts. I don't expect us to agree. I don't want us to agree. Like I say, we need both of those teams in order to keep both sides in shape and fighting fairly. But I do think we all have to be on the same playing field, or we have opened our way for this kind of disinformation that is going to permit the permanent rise of some kind of an autocracy and the destruction of our democracy. So what does this look like? What does this, somebody asked, what's going to come out of the pandemic? And I want to point out that one of the things, the reason I keep harping on this pandemic in my letters is because this is horrific. We are looking at the extraordinary loss of life, and we're off the charts compared to anybody else. And this administration has presided over that. And I just, as a historian looking at this, I don't even have words for it. And I've been extremely lucky. I certainly know people who've had this disease, but I'm not going to touch wood. I'm not going to say anymore. But this is unthinkable. So what's going to happen on the heels of this? Well, it's another thing to unsettle the country for sure. But when I look at this, one of the things that I think of is 1900 and 1900 and the Galveston Hurricane. And it's interesting because I was looking up, I've written on the Galveston Hurricane a lot, and I'm fascinated by it, but I always like to check stuff before I talk to you guys about it in case I don't remember, whatever. If you go on Wikipedia and read this about the Galveston Hurricane, it doesn't mention what I'm going to tell you. And that's this. What happens is there is a storm that hits Galveston, Texas in 1900. And the weather services knew it was coming, but they weren't really able to track accurately where it was going. And the people in Galveston didn't think it was going to hit them. And the governments in Galveston, the town government, which was a government that was loyal to a single man. It was a machine government. That means it's kind of like a I don't want to say it's a mafia because that implies that it's criminally behaved, but they all answer to a boss, to a governmental boss. He doesn't think anything's going to happen, and what happens is Galveston sits about 8 feet above sea level, and the storm surge from that hurricane was 15 feet. So Galveston is wiped over by 7 feet of water. And the storm winds are about 140 miles an hour, and Galveston is wiped out. I mean, it's just wiped out, and at least 8,000 people die, and there's damage all over the South. But Galveston is the really interesting question, because what happens is when this hits, this corrupt government doesn't know what to do. I mean, these guys were there to make money, basically, and they had no idea how to handle a disaster. So first of all, they try and organize gangs of people to sweep up the dead bodies because it's hot. And they literally, at gunpoint, pull together like 50 African-American men and make them start to move the bodies. And they move them out to sea, and they dump them in off a barge at sea, thinking that this will get rid of them. But the dead bodies, growing up on the coast, you learn a lot more than you should about drowned bodies. So, and I'm not going to tell you more about this, but it didn't work. And the waves brought them back in and dumped them now in really horrific condition back in Galveston. So then the government is like, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to house people. And so we don't have any kind of a social safety net in the country at this point. So the charity pours money into Galveston to try and help people, put up tents, do something. And the government is so corrupt and so inefficient, it basically just takes all the money. And it's just not able to do anything. So all this money is wasted. And finally, the people in the country are so furious, they create a new kind of government. And that new kind of government is the precursor to what is going to become the federal government in America in the 1930s and the 1940s, and that is they set up a nonpartisan. In this case, it's going to be called something different than the federal government is, but they set up a nonpartisan group of people whose job is not to be political partisans, but their job is literally to do a job. To distribute food and to make sure that Galveston gets rebuilt in a safe way, and to try and actually work for the people, not to redistribute contracts and to put money in people's pockets and all that. They are literally a board of people, a municipal government that is designed to work for the people. And that, I think, is a very instructive moment for us today, when I think we are seeing, to my mind anyway, a government that looks not unlike that Galveston town government or Galveston city government in 1900 that created a backlash where people said, we are done with people picking our pockets. We had a disaster. We had, even when people tried to help, you people screwed it up. We're now going to call in nonpartisan professionals to do our jobs, because at the end of the day, that's what government is. And that is, I think, maybe one way to think about what the country might look like going forward. And again, if you take anything from here, from what I say at all, but certainly what I say today, is that this election was not the end of anything, as I said beforehand and during. It's the beginning of something, because now there is a system in place Americans, people like you and me, regular people with ordinary voices, get to say to our local representatives and our state representatives and our federal representatives and our newspapers and our neighbors, this is what a good government looks like to me, and this is what I want. We don't have to say, what are you going to do to me? We need to say, we hired you. Here's the job we want you to do. And that's maybe a lot of work, but how much fun is that going to be? You know, we have the opportunity to rebuild this government for the first time in almost 2 generations. And that is, seems to me to be, you know, the doing in many ways is at least as fun as the having. All right, thank you for being here. I will be back on Thursday. I don't know what I'm going to do on Thursday yet, but I'm playing that one out. And thanks for being here again. Politics Chat, 4 o'clock on Thursdays. My name is Heather Cox Richardson, history professor, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these. Thanks for coming around. I will see you next week.